For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Madli. Joining me today is investigative journalist Jeff Wicks, here to discuss his book, The Shadow State: Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die. In the book, you describe this as your most challenging assignment of your career. Can you just briefly give our readers an overview of why Babita lost her life, and for you, what made this such a difficult assignment?
So when we started investigating Babita Deokaran's assassination, it was fairly clear to us early on that it was just that, an assassination. And I mean, that's really just applying logic to circumstance. So what we could see that she was shot multiple times, there was no attempt to steal any of her property. So that tells you it's a hit style killing. So we knew it would be important then. And it was a long road to walk in terms of investigating what she'd found. We were trying to answer the question of the why she would have to be killed. And the answer for us came several months later when we got our hands on her cell phone and her Gauteng Department of Health laptop. And we found that 3 weeks before she was murdered, she'd filed a report, which has become a critical document for us. And that report said there's anomalous spending at Tembisa Hospital, and she flagged 850 million rands worth of procurement, which had been executed just by that hospital in the space of 4 months. And she also identified a list of suppliers that she felt were dubious and required further scrutiny. Critically, there was 100 million rand in outgoing payments, which she'd frozen. And within 19 days of filing that report, she'd been assassinated. We found that the report that she'd filed was essentially suppressed and covered up because the money which was frozen was quietly released, and there was no forensic investigation into Tembisa Hospital affairs that she'd called for. And why this was such a challenge, I mean, there's many answers to that question. It's a complex and long-running investigation. We were dealing with immense troves of data, and also with the understanding that we would essentially be inheriting the danger that Babita faced because we were trying to finish her work. And when she was assassinated, her report was suppressed, and it was essentially a well-executed cover-up, save for the intervention of some bothersome investigative journalists. We revealed exactly what she'd found, and we now know that that extraction network is worth 2.3 billion rand in the space of 2 years. So challenging in that sense, a lot of things to work through, and then also the danger aspect that we had to consider, because if Babita was killed for that document and then we push it into the public domain, we would essentially face the same threats. And that's why it was such a challenge.
Now, your book also offers a look into Babita's life in the lead up to her murder. Why was it so important for you to include this personal dimension?
Well, I think in investigative journalism, it doesn't often lend itself to nuance and personal color because we're dealing with documents and procurement. It's relatively pithy subject matter. But that didn't fully tell the Babita Deokaran story, because in as much as she was a dedicated civil servant who'd made the ultimate sacrifice in the aid of reporting wrongdoing, she was also a mother, a loving sister, and she came from an incredibly tight-knit family. And that's the personal cost of corruption in South Africa. And that cost is ultimately borne by her family. So it was important for me to tell that side of the story of her life, the person that she was, because even in her formative years, it shaped her into the person that she ended up becoming, one who had a strong ethical code and was unwilling to look away when she found wrongdoing. And it was a valuable exercise because when we found out that she was a career civil servant, we found out that she'd been isolated and attacked before, just in a different strategy. She was hounded out of her post and suspended on trumped-up charges to enable pliant individuals to sign off on tainted COVID-19 PPE contracts. So her standing up for the right thing and for the truth and for being unwilling to bow to that was a feature of her personality even leading up to that point. I wanted to use that as a device for South Africans to understand that corruption, especially state procurement corruption, is never a white-collar crime, simply because the state has bottomless resources. When these illicit revenue streams are threatened, these profiteers call on elements in the underworld to do their dirty, wet work. And that's what we saw in Babita Deokaran's case.
Now, can you just briefly give our readers an idea of what happened when they assassinated her?
So she had just dropped her teenage daughter at school, and she'd stopped at Checkers to buy some groceries. I mean, these were something that everyday South Africans do. And unbeknownst to her at that point, she was being followed, even through the aisles of Checkers. In fact, these hitmen had lain in wait, and they'd been surveilling her for longer than a week. And she left Checkers and headed home. It was all very close to her house. And as she pulled up to her driveway, another car pulled alongside hers and just opened up a salvo of gunfire onto her. And she was shot 12 times. So that was the ruthless and brutal intent behind her murder that gave us an idea that there's way more to this in terms of motive than just a hijacking or a robbery gone awry. She'd been killed for a purpose, and ultimately we were proven right when those 6 hitmen were arrested and then followed a protracted court process which culminated in 2023 when they were convicted and sentenced through a plea agreement with the state.
Now, you mentioned having access to Babita's personal devices and that you found critical information around Tembisa Hospital. Can you give our readers an idea of the scope of the information that you found?
Oh, it's massive, absolutely massive. When we consider just the email database alone, it's 60,000 individual emails and documents. So wading through that, the challenge for us as journalists is then to try and sift the wheat from the chaff, because there's a lot of gumph on there, stuff that is of absolutely no benefit to our investigation. And then beyond that, we had her cell phone. And what that allowed us to do was literally plot the last month of her life, in some cases down to the second, because it would track Google searches when you connect or disconnect from your Wi-Fi, the calls you make and take, the messages you send and receive. So there was a lot of the personal side of Babita Deokaran that I was able to see there, but also with her work. And why that became important for us was our thesis was that she died investigating something at Tembisa Hospital. And that something was never going to be in isolation. And what her phone and laptop allowed us to do was basically take those 2 data sets and merge them into a single timeline. And in investigative journalism, a timeline is invaluable because it gives you context and it allows you to say, well, there was this event that potentially triggered this, which potentially then led to that. So it's key in our understanding of the way things transpired. And it was truly massive. I mean, I had to take 3 months off diary, not producing, not writing anything for News 24, simply just to read. Because the other thing is, it's never neat and orderly. Documents will have just numbers as their names. So you have to try to figure out exactly what you're looking at. And I think what we were able to do was tell a story which really sets out the depth and depravity of extraction networks, how they've infiltrated these government departments, enabled by people from within, and then are basically just left to pull money out of the system, which is ultimately destined for the poor and indigent community that relies on Tembisa Hospital. And we followed the money, because once we understand who were behind these dubious companies, we could see that it was in fact just a shell game. There is an example of one individual who ended up controlling 60 entities which were in trade with the hospital all simultaneously. And then what does that money get spent on? Supercars, houses, mansions, the finer things in life. And I think the underlying psychopathy of all of that is that it was all of their trappings of wealth that the profiteers went and extracted from the hospital were actually intended to save lives of the poorest of the poor. And instead, we have mansions that end up being featured on top billing as a case in point of how the money was pulled out of the state and into the pockets of a select group of very wealthy individuals.
Now, Babita's devices were in possession by the Hawks, and your book says that they basically didn't do anything with it. They didn't examine her devices. What does that tell you about the nature of the investigation? Was it actually a misstep or something more?
So the failings of the Hawks and of law enforcement is a trope that extends throughout the book because there were so many missteps. And in isolation, you could perhaps say, well, it's not really catastrophic. But when you look at them as a collective, it leaves you with the inescapable conclusion that either the people advancing this investigation are either so inept and incompetent that they would struggle to dress themselves in the morning, or they were somehow complicit. And one of the most egregious examples of this is exactly how they handled the digital forensic evidence. So the phone and the laptop were seized from the family on the day after the killing. And then the police are required to forensically image that, basically make a mirror image of that device, which can then be examined and formalized as evidence. When we got access to the devices 7 months later, we could prove digitally that the Hawks had never so much as even turned them on. They had completely cast aside that evidence. And just to sort of explain the import of that, when we first got access to the emails, one keyword search of Tembisa brought up Babita's report. We found that report that ended up being the basis of our entire investigation and now the basis of this book within seconds. So if the Hawks had gone looking for it, they would have found it. And that to me never really made sense. And what never made sense was their bold denials that yes, they had imaged it. But what became fatal for them was that when they were forced to ask the family for the devices back, because we, by that point, were publishing. And they were caught with their pants down. It gets even worse in that when the hitmen who took the plea and sentencing agreement named their recruiter and shooter, it was a man that the Hawks had in custody, arrested 10 days after the murder, and he was released, and his cell phones were never examined. And all the bundles of money he had on his person were then returned to him. So I agree. The reader will have to confront themselves with the question, are we at a point where our cops are at such keystone level that they cannot actually apply logic and do the work that is necessary? Or did they slow walk it on purpose? And there's no real conclusion to that because the Hawks have managed to shield themselves behind this refrain of it's an open investigation. We cannot comment on it. And that's 4 years later. And what underscores their failure, in my view, is the fact that the last time people were arrested for Babita Deokaran's murder was on the 27th of August, 2021.
So, Jeff, you spoke to the SIU about the information you had uncovered during your own investigation. So why did you, as a journalist that was actively working on the story, decide to take that route?
So for me, I believed it then, and I believe it now that I was acting in the public interest. It's one thing for me to write and expose things, and then when people come asking for help, you have this supine response where you say, go do your work. And to an extent, arms of the state should do that. But I know what I was doing at Tembisa Hospital, I was doing in isolation. And I knew that the SIU were actively following the stories that I wrote. And beyond that, there was a lot that I felt that I knew that I could never prove and never publish. And I thought it would be valuable for them to know that. Now, some journalism purists would say I crossed a boundary and there should be this Chinese wall between the state and the fourth estate. I disagree. And truth be told, I would do it again. I don't feel like I misstepped. The public interest is at the core of what we do because we want to effect change. And the people who extracted cash from Tembisa Hospital deserve some comeuppance in some way. And if I could steer the SIU in the right direction, beyond what I was already doing publicly through my work, then I was happy to take that meeting.
Now, Jeff, you've been deeply committed to preserving Babita's legacy and highlighting her sacrifice. What outcome would bring closure or justice for her family, in your view?
Well, I think we need to arrest this backslide of impunity that is exemplified or sort of surrounded Babita's case. There's no justice for the Deokaran family that the people or person who ordered her killing still breathes free air 1,500 days later. So in that respect, we must hold the Hawks accountable. And beyond that, we must hold people like the SIU and the police investigating the corruption aspect of things accountable, because until that investigation is concluded, nothing stops the state from doing business with these individuals. And we know, as recently as 3 months ago, some of the people we named and exposed and who are currently under investigation are getting more state tenders. Vusi Cat Matlala is a perfect example. While he's under investigation by the Hawks and the SIU for Tembisa procurement fraud, he scores a 360 million rand tender from the police, the same organization that's essentially investigating him. Now he's before court linked to 3 separate assassinations, and Babita is not one of them. So I think it's important for the Deokaran family that they get some modicum of justice, and just arresting the hitmen and convicting them is a step in that direction, but it's not the complete journey. Hitmen and izinkabi are disposable pawns in this game. And it's also important to keep her memory alive because of what she stands for. In death, she's become symbolic as not only a dedicated civil servant, but a heroic whistleblower who paid the ultimate price for doing the right thing. And I cannot abide a situation where we just forget her case, like we've forgotten so many others. So I made a promise to the family early on in my investigation that I would follow the story to the end, regardless of the danger it courted or no matter what it cost, because I believe the story was important, not only for them, but for South Africa and for our democracy. And we've seen it. Last week, Boa Finiguk assassinated in his office. It's always the auditors or the accountants because they know where the bodies are buried. And we cannot have a scenario where we have these targeted killings, which are so clearly hits, and the best we can do is arrest the hitmen. We have to go further than that, because the message that sends is that, for sure, you can pay someone to eliminate one of your enemies, and the chances of you getting caught are minuscule.
So what does Babita's story tell us about the current state of whistleblower protection in South Africa, and what lessons should lawmakers be taking from her case?
So, one of the key shortfalls is that On the technical legislative definition of what a whistleblower is, Babita is not one. She never filed a protected disclosure. She simply filed a report. She's become iconic as a whistleblower in death, and I think rightly so. But we need urgent legislative reforms to increase protection around whistleblowers, to incentivize them to blow the whistle, because that's the real damage of Babita's story, is how many people didn't come forward or saw something and chose to stay silent. That's the damage we'll never be able to measure. So it's important that Babita's story catalyzes a number of things. So legislative reforms, so the people who walk in the footsteps after her are protected. And then also that we end a culture of impunity. Those who made money from Tembisa Hospital must be made to pay it back, and they must face the full brunt of the law. Even more so, the people who paid those hitmen 400,000 Rand to take her life. It's unconscionable that we're 4 years on after her murder, and at this stage, we are as close to finding the mastermind of her killing as we were 3 days after she was murdered.
And lastly, Jeff, as you say in your book, the shadow state is its own economy in South Africa, and innocent people such as Shonisane Letore, who you mentioned in your book, they pay the price. So how does South Africa begin to effectively dismantle this form of corruption and state capture, which you write is blossoming?
Yeah, well, I think the shadow state is really just a device to talk about the new evolution of state capture. I mean, if we think about the Zuma epoch and his dalliance with the Guptas, state capture was like quite neatly defined. It was linear. You had easily definable villains in the Gupta brothers with their political influence exerted through Jacob Zuma. And they targeted multi-billion Rand SOE contracts. Now, what Babita found and what happens in clinics and schools and departments of social development all across the country is small, insignificant extraction that attracts little to no scrutiny, but it's executed at scale. And that's what should scare us out of her story, is that this is the evolution of capture. They perfected several thousand individual contracts over 2 years, amounting to 2.3 billion Rand. That's just what we know about. We don't know what's happening at Mamelodi Hospital. We don't know what's happening at Barra. We don't know what's happening at Helen Joseph. But we do know that these syndicates had infiltrated 5 other hospitals. We know that they'd infiltrated other government departments, like the Gauteng Department of Education. So it should tell us that the depth and scale of this thing is truly beyond what we could have ever imagined. I mean, I know when I started writing the story, 850 million Rand was a big number for me. It's nearly a billion Rand. That's nearly quadrupled. And that's from one hospital. So there will be more that we'll see in this. And I mean, certainly from our side, we're not putting this investigation down. I made a promise to the family, and I intend to keep it, holding those who should be responsible for giving them justice to account, because they've been failed roundly. And I think that's basically where I'm going forward.
That was investigative journalist Jeff Wicks discussing his latest book, The Shadow State, Why Babita Deokaran Had to Die.